So, welcome everyone to this lunchtime's IHR Digital History Seminar, our final seminar of the academic year. And my name's James. I'm one of the conveners of the Digital History Seminar, and it's my delight to welcome Nathan Richards, who's an assistant professor in history at the University of Nottingham. Nathan works on the impact and role of contemporary technologies on memory and creative approaches to the past, with a focus on the Black past, particularly the Black Atlantic. And today, Nathan will introduce us to the technomemetic or technomnemonic. Maybe I mispronounced that.
Entirely up to you.
which is his contribution to kind of the language of inquiry around digital humanities, digital history, and the digital Black Atlantic scholarship. Nathan will be speaking today for around 30 minutes, after which there'll be some time for Q&A at the end. If you're new to the Digital History Seminar, welcome. And if you're not new, I'll also remind those who are not new as well as who are new that please do put questions in along the way if you would like to have them queued up for the end in the chat, but you can also raise your hand as well and we can bring you in when we get to that point. But I will hand over to Nathan.
Thank you, James. I hope you can all hear me. I really appreciate you inviting me, James, to give this talk today, and thank you, Alice, as well. So this is a topic, the technomnemonics, or as Caroline Bassett calls it something else. You can call it whatever you like. I call it the technomnemonics. It's part of a series I guess I'm working on, thinking about the way in which technology very specifically shapes Black memory ecologies, a kind of Black diaspora communities across the Atlantic world. And there's loads of different ways in which this kind of technology, in terms of tools and platforms and methods, are kind of shaping what that kind of culture looks like. And this is one of a number of kind of areas I'm looking into that I'd like to develop a little bit further. Hopefully this is building on my PhD research, and hopefully this should emerge as a book in the next 18 months, potentially. But this current iteration that I'm going to share with you today is really a work in progress, and very much so builds from that initial research I did around about 2019, which brought up a number of questions, which led me to this. But it's very embryonic, and in many ways, it feels like what I'm going to share with you today, that I've discovered a three-legged mutant frog in a stream, and I don't know what to do with it, and I don't know what it means. But I'm inviting you to prod it and look at it with me, and maybe we'll come up with some ways forward for this project. So I invite feedback. Please do ask questions, share whatever information you possibly have. So I'm primarily going to be reading, and so that might get a little bit heavy in places. There is one section in the middle of the paper that gets a little dense, but beyond that, the rest of it's relatively conversational and light. So I'll begin very simply. I really do love this picture that's on the title of the presentation today. So I'm just going to let that linger for a second longer. So technomnemonics, navigating the middle passage across algorithmic undercurrents. So in 2019, while I was writing up my PhD research, I decided that I wanted to explore and analyze content related to Black history on YouTube. And that was just part of a kind of broader exploration I was doing into kind of Black history and digital history. But what I wanted to know about YouTube was what key historical themes were popular among the Black African diaspora on the platform. Specifically, I wanted to, kind of get an insight into the kind of regional and local iterations of the large historical narratives that shape the memory ecology and historical practices amongst this Black diaspora, and the kind of national projects that differently impact and shape this kind of Black Atlantic community. So what did the return content look like? Who was producing it? What was the nature of the commentary and user engagement? Who was the intended audience of this material? What did it reveal about the diaspora communities and how they mediate the national and the local, and so on? I assumed, I made a number of assumptions, and perhaps naively, that there would be a significant degree of commonality, particularly in terms of the language used around this history, even allowing for those kind of linguistic differences. By this, I guess what I mean is I expected to see many of the same kinds of phrases, terms, and historical ideas that were familiar to me in the Anglophone world, represented in the Francophone and the Lusophone. And I was specifically looking at those two large groups, less so the kind of Dutch and Spanish. I imagine the same historical themes would persist in these different places, just articulated through French and Portuguese. And fundamentally, my findings weren't entirely at odds with that kind of expectation, but one aspect really did surprise me, and that's the focus of today's seminar. So Atlantic slavery, what scholars such as Clifford, Gilroy, Robert Cohen identify as a foundational crisis and moment of creation for the Black diaspora, was a key theme I wanted to explore through YouTube content. Rather than simply translating the term Atlantic slavery and other terms into Portuguese to locate the necessary material, I reached out to some colleagues in Brazil, really just to gain a kind of a clearer understanding of the vernacular most associated with the history. I asked quite a few Brazilian-based scholars about the prevalent terms used to define the history of African presence in Brazil. And again, naively, I asked what the Portuguese translation of the Middle Passage was. And this is where I encountered something I hadn't really anticipated. All but one of the people that I spoke to was absolutely unfamiliar with the term. And the one that was familiar with the term said that it wasn't commonly used in English nor in Portuguese. The movement of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic was simply referred to as the trafficking. Of course, trafficking doesn't quite capture the essence of the Middle Passage. While the term designates the forced movement of enslaved African people across the Atlantic world within the Anglophone diaspora, it's also come to signify a kind of conceptual terrain, one used to think about the meaning of that movement culturally, politically, metaphorically, and metaphysically. It's a framework that enables scholars in the Anglophone world to situate this movement as a critical moment of modernity, and I think that's really important. It's been taken up by academics, but also kind of circulates more broadly in the Anglophone world through the music, visual culture, literature, and arts. So discovering this linguistic and conceptual gap, something that may have been obvious to many of my colleagues in the field, compelled me to think about the different ways this kind of fractured nature of this Black diaspora. It led me to realize that so much of what I'd taken for granted about Black Atlantic history and culture was in fact really just grounded in an Anglophone perspective, one that doesn't necessarily translate into or reflect the context and historical understandings of Francophone and Lusophone worlds. So this sent me down a path of thinking about how digital platforms, particularly at the time YouTube, mediate these differences in understanding. Do they work to draw communities together, to build bridges, or, and some of the fears I had, do they create kind of hierarchies of visibility, importance, and dominance? How might they do so through algorithmic processes and on YouTube and on other microblogging sites, as well as through broader internet architectures? So after I completed this kind of 2019 research, these were the kinds of questions that came up for me, and primarily they emerged from this divergence around the term, the Middle Passage. And that's basically what this research that I'm trying to conduct now is about. So do memories compete for engagement online? Are some subsumed or overshadowed by more dominant strands of memory, which are themselves reinforced by the hegemonic communications infrastructures that shape the internet more broadly? What does this mean for local understandings of the past, and how can communities push back, resist against these processes online, while also building bridges to expand and deepen the memory ecology of the Black diaspora? And you'll see that I'll use these terms, kind of memory ecologies, Black memories, And I sometimes use that interchangeably with history, but I'm thinking about history as a kind of professional discipline and more this kind of cultural engagement with the past that's kind of taking place. And so this is the dense part that I was talking about. I think in order to provide you a kind of oversight or insight into the research I'm currently doing, you kind of have to have a bit of a sense of the algorithmic processes on YouTube. And this isn't too heavy, but I'll give you a kind of a synopsis of what's kind of taking place and some of my findings from that 2019 research. So then we can begin to kind of look at my concerns for the kind of contemporary moment. So this lasts for about 5 minutes, so bear with me. One of the pressing concerns for academics and researchers exploring the role of YouTube in our contemporary lives is centered around efforts to understand the extent to which the platform's business imperatives shape the kinds of content we see and engage with, and how the financial and political motivations, along with user activity, inform the black box algorithm that directs the recommendation system and types of content that occupy the most visible spectrums of the platform. Ranked as the second most visited social media platform in the world, YouTube boasts over 2 million active monthly users with 1 billion hours of content viewed daily around the world. Though not technically a search engine, YouTube's search functionality is the second most visited engine in the world, second of course to its parent owner. With 37 unique channels which cover topics ranging from makeup tutorials, gaming commentaries, comedy and prank shows, news, politics, heritage, and music, the platform offers billions of hours of diverse content for its global audience. And a little on demographics. While North America and Europe account for 8 and 10% of global populations, respectively, their presence as users on YouTube dominates. And this can be seen in the kind of global distribution of views. Both regions are responsible for 27% each of the worldwide viewing figures, 54% combined, with unsurprisingly the USA and UK dominating these regions. Though 80% of all videos uploaded to the platform emerge from outside the USA, the impact of user activity from the US and Europe on the platform has far-reaching impact on all users and producers. Additionally, 5 of the top 10 most viewed channels on the platform in 2020 at least, which amass millions of fans, subscribers, and views, come from inside the USA, while 21% of the top 50 channels are primarily English speaking. Recent figures suggest that the top 3% of videos amount to nearly 85% of views on the platform. That's 3% of the videos amount to nearly 85% of the views, a disproportionate amount of which emerge from within the USA and Europe. So what impact does this user activity have on the platform, on content and crucially diverse heritage and memory representation? This question can be answered partially by a brief look at how the algorithm of the platform functions, how the role of corporate interest and user activity coalesce to create that much sought after and lucrative visibility on the platform. So in 2012, YouTube underwent a drastic redesign, one not simply aesthetic in nature, but actually fundamental to how users navigate and consume content. The redesign was intended to make the site more sticky, and this is a euphemism which was deployed to kind of keep users on the site for much longer, consuming more content, and in turn driving up ad revenue. The information management system that directs the flow of content on the platform is comprised of search algorithms, ranking systems, and referral mechanisms. The 2012 redesign resulted in a shift away from simply promoting videos with the most views, and instead the refined algorithm began to favor visual and audio quality and content without explicit adult themes, and political themes, a move that many would argue was done primarily to monetize the work of users by aligning content with potential advertisers. The new recommendation system that emerged increased viewing tenfold, with now 70% of viewing time on the platform coming from YouTube's algorithmically determined suggestions. So the details of the algorithm deployed on the platform are essentially unknown to those outside of Google, but there are efforts by researchers and technologists to understand its components, efforts that are often hampered by the regular alterations made to the algorithm, in addition to a multitude of different user versions of the platform in operation at any one time. It's clear, however, that YouTube employs some form of collaborative filtering analysis into the information management system, which is a sophisticated aggregation of user activities and practices to inform the selection of the 200 million videos it suggests to users a day. These videos, which appear alongside other clips that users are currently viewing and in personalized playlists on the homepage of users, are ranked and recommended by the algorithm according to the date of upload, its freshness, the viewing session, the duration of previous viewers, hidden tags and keywords, titles, descriptive attribution, and increasingly, and this is quite important, the semantic information available in the auto-generated closed caption data. So if you're interested in exploring this further, I recommend you reading the work of Shena Petrobruno. It's a great bit of work that they're doing, and you can run a Google search for that work. So while it's difficult to determine all of the features of the algorithm and indeed the extent to which these features impact recommendations, of the user-generated data, viewing session is considered one of the key determinants of where content is ranked and whether content is recommended by the platform's information management system. Viewing session is a crucial component as it indicates the length of time previous users spent on a specific video, whether they watched it to the end or at what point they stopped watching, and additionally, if their viewing led to further video selections. This information then highlights to the algorithm what videos have that sticky factor, extending and encouraging further viewing by users. The average length of videos on the platform is around 4.4 minutes long, of which around 60% of viewers will watch to completion, whereas videos 1 to 2 minutes in length often result in 75% of viewers watching to completion. 50% of videos on the platform have fewer, 50% of videos on the platform have fewer than 89 views, which I guess suggests that there is diversity on the platform, but not much of it is essentially engaged with. Videos that are stopped midway through are punished by the algorithm, removed from syndication recommendation as incomplete viewings, and videos increase the likelihood of an end to the broader video session on the platform, an act that directly impacts the corporate interests of the platform and that vies for user retention. So that's the big block part that I think is really useful to kind of have in mind as you move through. So here are some of the findings of my 2019 kind of analysis between these different language regions. So firstly, let me start with the two obvious findings, which I've kind of already outlined. Number one is that YouTube plays a powerful but largely unregulated role in curating historical and heritage content, especially when it comes to Black diaspora history or marginalized histories. It's not just a platform for sharing videos, it acts as a kind of memory infrastructure, shaping how communities remember and engage with the past. This means that YouTube does not simply host content, it actively participates in what stories are told, how they are circulated, and which histories gain visibility. The second point is that the way YouTube's algorithm works has a huge influence on what content rises to the surface. It tends to favor videos that are professionally produced, visually polished, and often come from established media outlets. This is shaped by commercial priorities, particularly those tied to, of course, advertising revenue. As mentioned, factors like watch time, viewer engagement, upload freshness, and metadata such as titles and descriptions all feed into what gets recommended. Language, geolocation, and even how well closed captions are generated also have a direct impact on how content circulates and who gets to see it. So those are the two obvious ones. So more specifically, when we look at content across different languages, and when I'm thinking about different languages, I'm thinking about this Francophone, Lusophone, and Anglophone worlds, we see some distinct patterns begin to emerge in relation to kind of Black history, Black historical content. In English-speaking contexts, what we might call the Anglosphere, the most viewed content tends to focus heavily on themes of slavery, race, and systemic racism. These videos often take the form of consciousness-raising interventions with passionate delivery and strong engagement, particularly from users in the US and UK. The emphasis here is on racial oppression and collective identity. The viewing figures from the English-speaking material I looked at were cumulatively the largest across the different language demographics. So the single video with the most views came from the Francophone world. In the Francophone world, content takes a different shape. Here, the focus is more on colonization, on democracy, and on economic development. The tone is often more institutional and political, with videos featuring state leaders or development experts. The memory framework here is oriented less towards racial trauma and more towards post-colonial reconstruction and national sovereignty. And I think there's a really interesting nuance between the Anglophone and the kind of Francophone. And I think this is in part related to the kind of French Caribbean having a more diminished voice in this diaspora community than so you would get West Africa Francophone sites. And my particular area of interest, the Lusophone regions, particularly Brazil, the focus is more didactic. The content is educational in tone, often tied to school curricula or national historical narratives. There's a strong emphasis here on cultural retention, how African traditions have shaped national identity. And while slavery is addressed, it's presented in a more measured, less confrontational tone. Issues like racism are less prominent in the Anglophone context. So one of the biggest disparities in the visibility of content across language regions lies in kind of visibility. Although English accounts for just 20% of the videos uploaded to YouTube, English language content dominates viewership, as I mentioned. Meanwhile, non-English content faces several disadvantages. Automatic captioning struggles with regional accents. Production quality is often lower due to fewer resources, and videos from non-Anglophone countries are less likely to be surfaced or recommended. The closed caption generation offers a significant opportunity to engage with content in different languages, but the system is not great at initially capturing non-English language. And if you add to that also kind of these regional dialects within that, leading to substandard translation, which of course impacts engagement from non-native speakers, say English speakers looking at Brazilian Portuguese content. And this is something I'm sure that many of us experience when we turn on the translation software for YouTube. There are moments where it's great and you can follow along, and then it's just gobbledygook and you just cannot make sense. And that isn't always the case, or as prevalent the case the other way around, when content is translated from English into a language. There, that translation process seems to operate a little more effectively. So the result of this is that the Anglosphere ends up setting the aesthetic and thematic norms for the Black diasporic memory on YouTube. Its content becomes the most visible, most circulated, and most rewarded, even though it represents only a segment of the broader Black global experience. So remember, their content is aligning more with these marketing, political imperatives that are shaping this kind of algorithm. They set the trend, and that means others have to kind of follow suit or get left behind by the algorithm. So, despite limitations, users are not powerless. The algorithm, while opaque, is not fixed. It is responsive to user behavior. Communities can, and in fact, retrain it by actively engaging with underrepresented content through commenting, liking, sharing, correcting subtitles, and using diverse metadata. Users can influence what gets surfaced and recommended. And I guess you can kind of call this kind of algorithmic activism, and the idea that digital communities can shape the architecture of platforms or the flow of information on platforms like YouTube to better reflect their histories and concerns and cultural practices. It's not a call just to consume content passively, but to interact with it in ways that push back against these algorithmic biases and expand the visibility of Black diasporic memory. So if you want some more information about those findings and about that research, you can send me an email. That material was written up. It'll probably be in the chapter of the book soon, that I'm happy to kind of share with you. But now I want to move on to how those findings led me down a slightly different pathway, or gave me the kind of foundations to think about a slightly different topic related. So at the top of the presentation, I hinted that the terms I used to run specific searches were all relatively general and easily translatable, with Black history and Atlantic slavery being the two most prominent terms that I used and translated. When starting that research, I had intended to use the term the Middle Passage, but I had to abandon this, really when I found out that it just was such an embedded Anglophone term, and related to the kind of discourse on Black history within that region. It's not prominent in French, in the Francophone world, and it's near absent in the Lusophone community, arts, historical, and intellectual worlds. Now, the term the Middle Passage is not entirely absent from scholarship related to Atlantic slavery in Brazil. There are numerous texts, mainly from Anglophone scholars, that have casually used the term the Middle Passage in reference to the Lusophone world. Examples are Richard Graham's Another Middle Passage article and Trevor Hall's Before the Middle Passage, which is a collection of translated manuscripts, among many, many others. In these texts and other English language scholarship, there's little effort taken to grapple with how the discursive elements of the term might apply differently to Brazil. And this is not necessarily a critique of the work, but more a reflection of how strongly I feel about the kind of strengths and limitations of the Middle Passage, now that I kind of understand this kind of conceptual gap. More recently, there's been some emerging scholarship from Brazilian writers and creators who have begun to borrow this term, translated often to passagem do meio, and often bracketed alongside the English Middle Passage term in their work. These efforts, I think, are more useful, as there's a clear attempt in this work to try and adopt and adapt understanding of the term and its inherent kind of discursive elements into Brazilian context. There are others, scholars still, that engage conceptually with similar ideas found within the Middle Passage discourse, but they tend to avoid using the term at all. So why does this matter, you might ask? So let me outline the fuzzy parts. So giving you the background to the research, how I ended up here, and I've given this insight to the kind of algorithmic process of YouTube. Now, I want to flesh out my concern with the term the Middle Passage on platforms like YouTube, but also elsewhere, and how this relates to algorithms. And I think this is important because it's illustrative of many other kinds of hegemonic encroachments that are happening every day online, as it pertains to memory cultures and ecologies, but also, I'm sure, in other domains. So firstly, what I'm attempting to highlight here is not just an issue around translation, but how the term, the Middle Passage, brings to the fore a critical conceptual divergence that exists within the memory ecologies of the Black Atlantic diaspora. The term, in its current instantiation, functions within very specific memory schemas, grounded in Anglophone diasporic thought, drenched in the metaphoric and affective registers generated by the theorizing, creative efforts, and gradual cultural adoption and evolution by Anglophone scholars, creatives, and communities. The case of Brazil offers a divergent site where this underlying discursive and mnemonic schema is not present. The discourse around race, memory, movement, and even modernity are filtered through different national and cultural lenses. One that conceptualizes and practices a racial politic that emphasizes masturgism or race mixing, and one that has framed the Afro-Brazilian identity through a logic of cultural syncretism. Rather than rupture, we have continuation and retention. So I'm reminded here of the important work of Castillo Serracua, who, a Brazilian, writing in English about Brazil's Black expressive performance cultures, chooses to use the term teatro negro in his English language work instead of the term Black theatre, to emphasize the cultural and contextual differences that give rise to performance cultures in Brazil, informed by the racial and national projects shaping that nation. And he argues that this term, Black theatre, is so drenched in this kind of African-American context that it potentially obscures very specific context in which Techo Negro is trying to make sense of Brazilian Black performance cultures. So indeed, many of the scholars, Brazilian scholars I mentioned earlier, demonstrate that the historiography of race and slavery in Brazil operates with distinct temporalities and effective priorities. When the term the Middle Passage, or Passagem do Meio, does appear, it is usually situated within broader narratives of trafficking or Atlantic commerce, not as a conceptual rupture or metaphysical turning point into modernity, but as a logistical node within a vast imperial machine. The term tráfico negreo, or slave trade, dominates, and with that comes a distinct set of cultural, historiographical, intellectual, and affective investments. And this is the central kind of site of my current research interest, guided by the theories, the data that I currently have to a point, but also beginning to kind of speculate to see what's out there. What is the impact of the algorithm in not only mediating historical terms, but the historical meaning and discourse that attend these terms? Do platforms like YouTube reinforce terminologies and historical meaning by collapsing regional specificity into the most searchable or most sticky versions of history? The Middle Passage in this environment does not become an historical moment or even conceptual domain, but a searchable commodity, packaged and favored by the algorithm, elevated by user familiarity and increasingly dominant across digital memory ecologies, buttressed by the hegemonic communications power of the Anglophone world. And so I think this is the central area that I'm interested in. This, as you may have seen at the top of this seminar, the original title of the paper was Cannibalising Algorithms, which I had a conversation with colleagues, Kelly Foster and Matthew Milbourne, and they absolutely hated the term for a host of reasons. And I was concerned about it myself, so I slightly shifted it. But here's the ghost of it here. And this is how I landed on that term, which is, of course, now contemptible, in reference to the epistemic cannibalizing that takes place, where dominant terms and frameworks subsume and flatten more local modes of remembering, be that national or regional. What becomes visible and legible on these platforms is not necessarily what is most meaningful to local communities, but what is most platformable, what works for the SEO, the underlying financial imperatives, what is captionable, and what retains users. In the process, the national and regional local memory ecologies in places like Brazil, but also elsewhere across the diaspora, get overwritten and marginalized or blunted. And of course, none of this is new. Absolutely none of this is new. We're all familiar with this, these kinds of older colonial and imperial mechanisms of erasure and standardization. But this process, I would argue, is accelerated, is worth looking at, particularly in this automated system that rewards conformity and punishes divergence, which govern circulation, form, and the survival of memory. And I think, additionally to that, what's interesting more so about this is that it's taking place among the Black diaspora, though of course contextualized within these broader colonial and hegemonic communications realities. So my concern in all of this is not that the Middle Passage as a discursive term is likely to incrementally creep into the cultural lexicon of Brazilian historical and memory practice related to slavery, as I can already see beginning to kind of happen. But instead, my concern is that this process in the digital is in part being propagated by algorithmic processes, curated by the unconscious digital mind, unconcerned with contextualization, with the slow incremental growth, adaptation and syncretism that often accompanies this kind of cultural exchange. And I guess this is kind of what it makes me think of. No human minds were burdened in this query response. Like we're just leaving this really important, these important debates, the discussions up to the processes. And of course, we'll touch on a little in a moment on AI. So we don't have to do this really complicated work of exchange, of dialogue, of contextualizing. You know, the algorithms are in part doing that for us. But what are we losing? What gets left behind? And so this brings me to a note on the world beyond YouTube. So that's the main thrust of my argument, this commodification of the term, the middle passage, and the power and the way in which that can kind of come to dominate because it's packaged in a particular way. And there's lots to do and there's lots to flesh out about what is actually happening. And I want to look at different data sets and other popular platforms, particularly TikTok, that really begins to build on the gains made by the YouTube algorithm in the kind of contemporary era, and actually just puts that kind of process into kind of overdrive. And so there's a couple of areas I want to kind of explore. And so I really do welcome kind of feedback in this area. But before I round up, I guess it's important to acknowledge that this flattening, this kind of subsumption, is not just an issue caused by algorithms and platforms like YouTube, but can be found really across the kind of the knowledge nodes of the internet more broadly on some of the most popular sites, such as like things like Wikipedia, as well as in the kind of responses generated by AI. So if we take a look, for example, at Wikipedia, which many AI apps reference for standard historical content, we can just see how detrimental this issue might become. The English Wikipedia page on the middle passage is absolutely extensive. It's got a dedicated group of editors, while the Francophone one is less than half its size, and there is no Lusophone one. It's absolutely tiny, at least it was the last time I checked. And this hints to a host of issues around the politics of knowledge, about what goes on in kind of Wikipedia behind the scenes. And I'm not best placed to discuss that. But if Kelly Foster is in the room, which I did send her the link for, perhaps she'll enlighten us. This is her area of kind of expertise, and she can kind of talk more towards this kind of politics of knowledge that takes place on Wikipedia. In addition, what happens when we search the middle passage in Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, in ChatGPT? Well, and I think this is interesting, and this is some of the stuff we've just been playing about over the last few weeks, you get a response that exclusively references Anglophone scholarship, which is unsurprising. But more crucially, you get this subtle but really significant effort by the system to contextualize the content into the Brazilian and historical cultural environment, absolutely unprompted. So if you simply search, what is the middle passage? It then tries to contextualize that into a Brazilian kind of context. We can see that just by searching the term in Portuguese, the system resorts to a logic that makes critical assumptions beyond the specifics of your query, assumptions about your interest, their location, and it doesn't really, of course, deal with this kind of consideration of these kind of crucial discursive nuances that we've been kind of reflecting on. Again, just kind of shows this kind of unconscious digital mind at play. Now, of course, if the term isn't popular in Brazil, why would anybody in Brazil be searching for it? Well, because it is part of this broader memory ecology online. It's absolutely possible that you're going to get some young student who perhaps sees it on a YouTube video and wants to kind of find out more about it, turns to ChatGPT, and he gets this machine-driven attempt to provide local understanding without highlighting the specific nuances and kind of complexities. And I think, this is just following the logic found more broadly in this kind of programming culture of the internet. Okay, so that's my three-legged mutant frog, which you can prod with me and look at. But what can be done about some of these things? I really don't know. I'm at such an early stage of thinking through this problem and this research that all I do know is that we kind of have to have a commitment to a kind of polyvocality in these memory practices. Approaches that don't assume coherence across the diaspora and that don't assume that the digital will automatically build these important bridges for us. Instead, we have to kind of make room for divergence in the building and reliance on tools and platforms. And so this means design tools, terms, pedagogies that allow for multiple memory projects to kind of coexist without being flattened into a kind of single hegemonic memory edifice. Of course, what Chimamanda cautions as the kind of danger of a single narrative, and in this case, the danger of a single Black memory narrative. How we do that, I think is open. I'm playing about with currently Walter Rodney's idea on groundings, which is a kind of kind of ground up, intellectualizing community kind of engagement. It's a very particular approach to kind of intellectual inquiry. And I'm thinking, what would that look like to develop into an app or a plugin that helps mediate this content, to provide you context, to speak to you about these kind of imbalances. I think it's quite a difficult project. It'd be quite challenging to complete, but I think it's a really interesting way for me to think about some of these problems and how we might find kind of solutions to them. I doubt I'll ever develop this app, but I do think it's useful to think through, what would a water wrote means grounded app look like to help us mediate this content. So I think I will leave it there, and I invite feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nathan, for a really fascinating paper. I mean, I especially enjoyed all the sort of how you teased in the kind of Lusophone and Francophone angles there, and the call to action around sort of polyvocal memory practices at the end was really great. Just a reminder to our audience, please do pop questions in the chat, or if you want to come in and say your question, we can do that. Just raise your digital hand or put something in the chat that says you'd like to come in.
Stop sharing as well.
If you stop sharing, that would be great. Thank you. Right. So while people are thinking, I'll take chair's privilege. So you gestured at one point towards kind of colonial modes of classification and categorization, and said kind of like there's something different going on here fundamentally around the sort of kind of acceleration of a set of processes around these things. And I wonder if you could just sort of expand on that thought a little bit more. For example, you maybe think of library catalogs and classification schemas when you started talking about the ways in which ultimately what YouTube is doing is creating a set of boxes in which things kind of sit and are classified. Because it seems to me the issue you're articulating here is about something more than, for example, the fact the algorithm is secret, with say the comparator here with say the library world might be that the BNF or the Library of Congress, their categorizations and classifications are public, but they're also problematic flattenings, but they are public problematic flattenings of complexity. And there's something, I guess my point is that it feels like you're saying something more than just that it's private. There's something really important and sort of in terms of how we think about knowledge organization, a kind of like an important shift going on here we need to be attentive to. Yeah, could you say something more about classification and the fundamental differences to colonial or historic modes of that outside of monolithic systems?
Well, I don't know if I am suggesting that they are that different. And I was having this conversation in part yesterday with Kelly. I don't know if they are that different. And what I think is happening is that the system it's sped up. Yes, in part that this is a kind of black box, and we don't know how it's doing this kind of classifying and recommending. And that's one part, but I think the major thing that I think is different about this moment is that this process is happening one in the dark, but also at such rapid speed. I think it's the acceleration that I'm more interested in, that we're just not even getting a chance to think through the exchanges that were taking place, and we don't have access to understand what it might be possibly doing. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know if I am saying that these older colonial systems of classification, whether through archiving, through ethnographic and anthropological kind of practices, are that different. I guess I'm saying that those are the same practices that are just accelerating and getting faster, and a significant part of that is slightly in the dark. And so it'd be good to kind of know that, but I think I don't know if they are that fundamentally different. I don't know if that answers the question, but I guess, do you want to clarify a little more?
No, it does. I think it's really helpful. I mean, I guess the way I would think about it would be that we to some extent knew that systems were building on top of systems that have been built before.
Yeah.
And that something's going on here is like it may well be building on those logics through some other ways and means, but nobody at YouTube kind of sat down and went, oh, let's start with Library of Congress classifications for these things.
Yeah.
They may be replicating the same problems, but
Yeah.
we don't know effectively.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think that's one aspect that not knowing is important. And the speed of things, I think, is what scares me, and the unthinkingness of it. That we don't know what was set in motion, and now it's kind of just doing half of these processes by itself, and just trying to make human connections and thought. Yeah.
Unthinkingness. I like that because that's a sort of like even if we know humans did things desperately wrong, we know they had some thinking that went into their
There's
mind.
something there, right? It just doesn't care. It doesn't care. It will just replicate a process. Yeah.
So I'll go to a question in the chat from Saskia, which I'll read out. So starting with some thanks for the talk, and that they want to copy the book when it's out. Their question is, do you have any thoughts on why the Francophone digital histories on YouTube lean towards more post-colonial politics, sovereignty and development, rather than racial trauma, identity and activism? Do you think it's something to do with education and internalized coloniality?
Again, another conversation I was having with Kelly last night. Surprisingly, if Kelly's in the room, she could really just answer half your questions. I mean, I think in part, as I kind of understood the conversation yesterday, we have to look at the way in which France plays a continued kind of role in kind of educating its former kind of colonies and its kind of engagement with those types of places in controlling essentially a kind of narrative. But I do think it's also in part to do with when you think about the Black Atlantic world, of course, I'm thinking about primarily the Caribbean and the North and South America. And those French Caribbean locations still have a very particular type of relationship to France. They're either still outposts of France and provinces of France. So I think that has its play. And so there just seems to be less work emerging from kind of Francophone Caribbean, but there are larger voices in these independent states of West Africa as part of the kind of Francophone world. So their voices seem to just dominate. And because they're not necessarily as concerned with this history of enslavement, because they're in place, they're independent nations, they don't necessarily have this direct connection with this history of Atlantic slavery, their conversations are concerned about nation building, about development. And again, that's in part due to the influence, I think, that France also plays in that kind of region, and controlling particular types of narratives. There's something about the Anglophone Caribbean, and of course, when we think about the Anglophone memory landscape of the Black Atlantic, of course, we're thinking about African Americans at the center of that in terms of their influence, and that kind of contentious history. And then you've got a similar type of contentious history in the Anglophone kind of Caribbean. People have been producing this type of work. They've pushed for kind of independence, and all of this is part of the kind of cultural landscape. And just in the French Caribbean, it just feels somewhat different. Not to say those things haven't taken place, of course, we know that they have, but they just feel somewhat different, which is muted the content that comes from there. And so, yeah, if you look at the content, so all of the findings of the Francophone highest viewed content on Black history, African history, Atlantic slavery, nearly all of it had these kind of state leaders. They were in these really professional settings, big halls, and there were conversations between development experts and state leaders. And there was the one video that had the highest views across all of this content was a kind of independent Francophone conversation with the Anglophone world. And it was really interesting. And that felt more like a community piece outside of those kind of large scale. And that was the only piece that really jumped out to me from the Francophone world. Almost everything else was exclusively this kind of professional output that was the most viewed in that region. So I think that says something about the influence of France in that.
Thanks, Nathan. There's no other questions in the chat at the moment, and
I
no one
have
has
a
a hand up,
question,
but
if
I
that's okay.
suspected Alice would have a question, so I'll let Alice come in.
Thank you. My question is about the timing of your 2019 research, because I think it's interesting that it is just before short form content, you know, just skyrockets.
Yeah, yeah.
And I wondered if, I know that you said that this is accelerating. Is it just getting faster, getting stronger, or do you think it's going in another direction with short form content?
I mean, I don't know, and I think that's the next stage of the research. I think platforms like TikTok and this increasingly short form really build on the back of the gains made by YouTube's algorithm. What they did was really radical. And I think loads of the other platforms saw that and began to kind of think, okay, let's accelerate that kind of process. So I think it's related to YouTube, but I guess my next stage of the research is to really go and find out what is now happening. What does that look like? What does that mean? Is it accelerating, getting faster? Is it getting more depth? What kind of audience is it creating? What kind of content? I need to kind of find that material, find out a little bit more about the area. What I guess I am slightly disappointed with at the moment is I was looking at the Digital Services Act of Europe, and it has this really incredible component that gives access to researchers. And, you know, I was so excited when I saw it, thinking, this is great. I get access, and then I realized we're not part of the European Union again. And so what we have is the OSA, and James, you probably know, I can't remember what it is, of 2023. And it doesn't have any provisions for researchers. And so Ofcom's trying to work that in, but that would be fascinating to get access to look behind what are these algorithms doing, because that's what the DSA provides in Europe, that you can see what the processes and imperatives are behind it, and then you might be able to kind of answer some of those questions. So I'll continue working probably over the next year or so to see if I can answer those questions, but I don't know what the kind of rationale is. Yeah, I could speculate for you all day. I enjoy doing that, but we're in an audience of academics.
Yeah,
so.
I think I also am not sure about the relationship between kind of YouTube Shorts and YouTube, and to what extent they are informed by exactly the same algorithm. I'm not sure, but
YouTube Shorts seem to be almost they feel like an engagement with the way that TikTok maximized the original kind of Google algorithm, and then it seemed like they've gone back and tried to. That's what it feels like to me. I don't think it's that doesn't feel like a direct kind of evolution for me from the long form into the kind of YouTube short. That doesn't feel direct. It feels like that's a response to a kind of the influence of TikTok. That's what it feels like to me, but again, speculative.
thank you. And also thank you for the fascinating paper. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
I was really struck. Sorry, someone's. Do you want to read it out?
Yes, got another question from Matthew.
Yeah.
So he says he's really struck with the claim that the middle passage has become a searchable commodity, which is a really challenging and provocative statement, given that the term itself is grounded in analysis of the consequences of reducing human beings into a transportable commodity. I wonder if part of your intervention is the extent to which there is a tension between the imperatives of digital commodity culture and the complex differences in diasporic memory cultures. Could we say that Anglophone Black Studies is both entangled and an invisible beneficiary of this now digital commodity culture? Long question. Thank you, Matthew.
Amazing question. Absolutely incredible. Read the last part for me again. I think that was the most interesting.
So could we say that Anglophone Black Studies is both entangled and an invisible beneficiary of this now digital commodity culture?
Ooh, provocative. Yeah, I guess there's an argument to could we say that Anglophone Black Studies is both entangled and invisible beneficiary? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's definitely entangled with that. But I mean, I wouldn't. When has Black cultural production or memory cultures not been entangled with these types of institutions and power of commodity making. I mean, they have been for as long as we can kind of think about the presence of African folks in the kind of new world. So I don't think that's new in any particular way, but the first part of that question is absolutely yes. It gets to the heart of my concern around this kind of stuff. This sorry, it's another comment. Yeah, it gets to the heart of my kind of concern around this, about this commodification of something so critical like the Middle Passage for me as a descendant of this history and this heritage, how this material, this experience, this lived experience, this trauma becomes commodified in these types of shows. I think that's the reason that I guess I make these interventions, because I want to see like what is actually happening to this heritage. How is it being exploited by these invisible systems? And you know, in some ways we get to share this content and we get to kind of build bridges, and that feels important. But on the other hand, we are just inserting our memory cultures into this larger edifice, and you know, and it's inadvertently creating these hierarchies between us and these abilities for some people to make money off of this content, for the systems themselves to kind of, you know, it's bound up in a lot of issues. I don't know if there are any solutions to it, but I think, again, like my three-legged frog, it's just about, we need to kind of look at all of these different things that are here. I don't know what to do with all of them, but I think this is such a provocative question, and it kind of gets to the heart of what I too am concerned about.
And it's striking to me, if I could follow on from that, that what you focused on today is very much about commodification of collective sense of memory and identity, or not collective in a kind of singular sense, but a kind of diversity of perspectives. Whereas when you mentioned policy, for example, a lot of policy interventions seem to focus very much on the individual and the rights of the individual and individualized commodification through digital infrastructures, as opposed to this kind of sense of a community or collective sense of reshaping or flattening, which seems to be very central to what you're talking about from my perspective, which is that this is about something that's going on around collective sets of memory, which we perhaps don't attend to as much as we do the worries about the individual.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Matthew. That was great.
Are there any other questions from our audience today? If not, I'll just pick up a little bit on something you mentioned, Nathan, that was about next steps, which is often a question we ask at this seminar. You've gestured towards what you want to do, and I'm actually struck in a way that you've managed to do this work before the kind of short world came in, which means you've got a data set that, well, you've got a way of working and a kind of set of analyses we couldn't now replicate because we can't go back to YouTube 2019. So are the next steps around kind of tracing kind of tracing kind of trends that appear within the kind of like the memory space that, well, the digital space that's reshaping the memory space, and trying to kind of spend some time thinking about those critically and in depth, and before the next one moves along? Or have you got something else in mind for your work here? Because I'm mindful you called this volume 1. So
because you know, I guess this whole work I'm trying to do, this TechnoMnemonics, is really about looking at these really small, nuanced kind of case studies and the way in which the tech might be kind of shaping. And I've got a number of strange ones. They're not all about YouTube and algorithms and the kind of Middle Passage. Sometimes they're about particular practitioners in different places, the languages and tools that they're kind of using. And so the TechnoMnemonic Volume 1, this will probably become a paper with more kind of detail and citation in it, because if you can see what I've written here, there's hardly any citation, but I do know the work. And so I'm going to continue to do that over the next year or two, while also following, in this particular topic, I'm going to be following the trends of some of the things that were established by YouTube in this 2019 period, and try and trace it in the kind of contemporary moment. See, you know, as Alice said, what does this look like in this kind of contemporary shorter videos, tighter algorithm? What does that look like, and how, you know, how particular themes, historical themes, are emerging, disappearing, and trying to kind of look at some of those things. And I think that's really just to bring the conversation up to date. I think when I did the YouTube one, I wanted to turn it into a paper, but submitting, finding a job, I didn't get a chance. And now it doesn't feel right to try and publish that YouTube piece because it feels out of date. And so in order to kind of actually publish on this specific topic, I guess I just want to focus in and bring up to date. So there's a book coming out, probably in about 18 months, if I'm lucky, which is called the TechnoMnemonics. And it's a remix of the PhD research. Many of these types of topics will be in there. And then there'll be a series of papers on the TechnoMnemonics that will be published, hopefully with James' help in digital quarterly, digital humanities quarterly. Yeah, a number of different journals related to this kind of TechnoMnemonic volume 1, 2, 3, probably up to 5. So yeah, I'm working on a number of different things, as well as a number of digital history projects as well.
I suspect Alice has a final question. See, she popped on your video, but before I do, I'll just note that Saskia has mentioned in the chat that there's lots of interest in your work, potentially being publishing this with digital modern languages as an option. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Please email me. Yes, that would be great. Yeah, so I'll open the link. Oh, thank you. You sent me an email. Thank you. Thank you very much, James and Alice. I really appreciate you inviting me here. It's been really great to pull this material together to start doing what I should have done 18 months ago. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
It's a pleasure. Did you have any final thoughts, Alice, before we close?
My final thoughts were, what's next? So you covered it. So thank you very much. Thank you. It was absolutely fascinating.
It was. Thank you so much, Nathan, for joining us today. Thank you all those who joined in the audience and asked questions. This is our last seminar of the year. We'll be back as the IHR Digital History Seminar next year. I will put in the chat the best way to find out information about that is partly the website, but actually the mailing list is probably in these fragmented social media times. The best way to get information about our seminar is via the mailing list. So please do subscribe to that, and hopefully we'll see you at a seminar next year. And thank you again, Nathan.
Thank you.